In 1987, a small newspaper in the Philadelphia area published a story so strange that for a few days the entire town seemed to be talking about it. It was not about a crime. It was not about politics. It was not about a missing celebrity. It was about an 8-year-old boy named Thomas Whitaker, a quiet, thin child with very watchful eyes, who during a past life regression session said something that made everyone in the room freeze. He said he had once been an agent of the United States Secret Service. And not just any agent. According to him, in another life, his job had been to protect John F. Kennedy. But the sentence that truly turned the case into a legend came a few minutes later, when Thomas began to tremble, pressed his fingers into the arm of the chair, and whispered, "I was in the car." The story began months earlier, in a simple house on the outskirts of Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. Thomas was the son of a teacher named Margaret Whitaker and a mechanic named Daniel Whitaker. He was an ordinary child in almost every way. He liked cartoons, hated peas, was afraid of the basement, and always carried a small red toy car in his pocket. But there was something about him his family could never explain. Since he was very young, Thomas had repeated nightmares about a street full of people, a black car, screams, and the dry sound of gunshots echoing between buildings. His mother said he would wake up sweating, staring at the bedroom door as if he expected someone to walk in. Sometimes, still half asleep, he repeated phrases that made no sense for a child his age. "Don't leave the route open. There are too many windows. He shouldn't smile so much today." At first, his parents thought it was just imagination. Children invent monsters. Children have strange fears. Children hear things on television and mix them into dreams. But then Thomas began saying names. Jack, Clint, Roy, Greer. Margaret did not recognize those names right away, but Daniel, who enjoyed American history, went silent when he heard his son repeat over breakfast that Greer should have accelerated sooner. William Greer was the name of the driver of the presidential limousine on the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Thomas was 8 years old, and no one in the house remembered ever telling him that. It was a neighbor, Eleanor Price, who suggested Margaret contact Dr. Evelyn Hartman, a therapist known in the region for working with clinical hypnosis and memory regression. Evelyn was not famous. She did not appear on television. She did not promise miracles. Her office was on the second floor of an old building above a pharmacy, with walls covered in certificates, a shelf full of books, and a cassette recorder always positioned beside the armchair. The first session took place on March 14th, 1987. Thomas arrived wearing a blue jacket and holding the red toy car. He seemed more curious than frightened. While his mother filled out the paperwork, he stared out the office window at the cars passing in the street. When Evelyn asked if he knew why he was there, the boy answered, "Because sometimes I remember things that aren't mine." The therapist wrote that sentence down. Then she asked him to sit, breathe slowly, and imagine a staircase leading down to a safe place. Thomas closed his eyes. At first, he only described scattered images. A large room, a ringing telephone, a man laughing, the smell of cigarettes, polished shoes, a dark suit. Then his breathing changed. His voice became slower, and he said, "My name isn't Thomas." His mother was crying. The recorder was turning. Outside, cars passed normally in the street, as if nothing extraordinary were happening on the second floor of an old building above a pharmacy. After that session, Thomas's nightmares became less frequent. They did not disappear completely. For years, he was still afraid of fireworks on the 4th of July. He still avoided crowds. He still looked at high windows. But he stopped waking up screaming. He stopped saying he needed to go back to the car. He stopped repeating Greer's name in his sleep. As an adult, Thomas Whitaker rarely spoke about the case. According to people close to him, he would only say that he could not explain what had happened in 1987. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was a wound inherited from somewhere science still does not know how to measure. But there was one sentence he never denied saying. Years later, when asked whether he truly believed he had been Michael Rourke, the supposed agent who failed in Dallas, Thomas answered, "I don't know if I was him, but I know I cried his pain." And maybe that is what makes this story so hard to forget, because we can doubt names, we can question regressions, we can search for rational explanations, absorbed memories, coincidences, unconscious suggestions, everything the human mind is capable of building in the shadows. But one question still remains. Why would an 8-year-old child carry so much sadness for a man who died before he was born? Why would he tremble at the date November 22nd, 1963? Why would he describe the weight of a guilt that does not belong to childhood? Maybe Thomas Whitaker invented it all without knowing. Maybe his mind created a story to give shape to a nameless fear. Or maybe, somewhere deep within human consciousness, certain memories do not end when a life ends. They simply wait. They wait for another body, another voice, another silent room, and a moment when someone finally asks, "What are you seeing?" And then, after decades trapped in that same second, someone answers, "I'm in Dallas. I'm in the car. I still couldn't save him." He said that, for a few minutes, the two stood in silence. Then Kennedy asked if Michael was afraid of dying for another person. Michael said no. Kennedy asked what he was afraid of, and Michael said being alive afterward. That memory made the therapist pause the session, because that seemed to be the center of everything. Michael was not only carrying Kennedy's death, he was carrying his own survival. The fact that he kept breathing when the man he had promised to protect no longer could. The trauma was not only in the gunshot, it was in every day that came after it. At the end of the session, Evelyn asked Thomas to speak to Michael, as if that old part of him were still trapped somewhere inside. The boy stayed quiet. Then he said, "You couldn't stop the bullet." The therapist asked what Michael answered. Thomas began to cry. "He says he could have tried harder," Evelyn gently insisted. "But did you try?" The boy pressed the red toy car against his chest. "Yes." "Then tell him that." Thomas took a deep breath. "You tried." The room went silent. "I hated that photo," Thomas said, "because he was still alive in it." Dr. Evelyn asked when Michael died. The boy took a while to answer. "Years later, heart, but I think I had already died before." According to the account, Michael Rourke died carrying that same instant inside him. The sound, the turn, the sun, the president's hand at his throat, Jacqueline leaning in, the feeling of having failed in front of the entire world. Then the session took an unexpected turn. Evelyn asked Thomas to search for the moment between one life and another. The boy became very quiet. His breathing softened. For almost 2 minutes, no one spoke. Then he said, "I didn't want to come back." The therapist asked why. "Because I was afraid of protecting someone again." Margaret, his mother, began crying in the corner of the room. Thomas continued, "But I came back small. I came back without a gun, without a suit, without a president, just afraid of loud noises." It was at that moment that everyone realized something disturbing. Since he was a baby, Thomas had been terrified of dry, sudden sounds. Slamming doors, fireworks, cars backfiring in the street. Each noise made his whole body react before his mind understood what had happened. After that session, Margaret began observing her son differently. The way he always sat facing doors. The way he chose seats in restaurants by looking at the windows first. His discomfort in crowds. His exaggerated attention to rooftops when they walked through downtown. It was absurd to think that a child could carry the habits of a dead man, but it was also difficult to ignore. The story reached the local newspaper through Eleanor Price, the neighbor. She knew a reporter named Samuel Brenner who wrote human interest stories, the kind that mix small-town life, mystery, and a Sunday afternoon feeling. At first, Brenner thought it was an exaggeration. Maybe an impressionable mother, maybe a therapist looking for publicity, maybe an intelligent boy repeating things he had heard without anyone noticing. Then he attended the second session. It was on April 4th, 1987. This time, Thomas did not only repeat names and dates. He described details that were difficult for a child. He spoke about political tension in Texas, about rivalry among advisors, about the agent's discomfort with open routes, about the way Kennedy insisted on contact with crowds. He described the smell of the limousine's leather, the shine of metal under the Dallas sun, the sound of motorcycles, the way agents communicated with short glances because, according to him, whoever talks too much has already noticed too late. Samuel Brenner left the office unsure what kind of article to write. The following Sunday, he published a report titled, "The Boy Who Remembers Dallas." The article did not claim that Thomas was the reincarnation of a Secret Service agent, but it did not treat the case as a joke either. Brenner wrote that he had seen a child enter a trance state and narrate, with emotion impossible to fake, the memories of a man who claimed to have been only a few meters from Kennedy on the day of the assassination. The reaction was immediate. Some readers called the newspaper and said it was a fraud. Others wrote letters saying they, too, had strange memories from childhood. A retired professor sent a long response arguing that children absorb information without realizing it and then reorganize everything into narratives. A 72-year-old woman called crying, saying she had watched Kennedy's funeral procession on television and had never been able to forget Jacqueline's face. But the Whitaker family did not want fame. Margaret refused bigger interviews. Daniel became irritated with curious people showing up at the house. Thomas went back to school, where some children began calling him the President Boy. He did not like it. He said he was not the president. He was only the man who couldn't save him. That sentence followed the case for years. The third and final recorded session took place on April 18, 1987. In it, Dr. Evelyn decided not to lead Thomas directly back to Dallas. Instead, she asked him to find a happy memory from that life. The boy took a deep breath and for the first time smiled during the regression. He said he was in Hyannis Port on a summer afternoon. Kennedy was walking near the water. There was wind. Children were running. The president seemed less like a president there, more human, more tired, more free. Michael was standing at a distance, watching. Kennedy approached him with 2 glasses of lemonade and handed him one without ceremony. "You look like a man who has forgotten how to sit down," he supposedly said. Michael answered that he was working. Kennedy looked out at the sea. "We all are." Thomas smiled as he told it, as if time breathed before it broke. Then came the first sound, a dry crack. Some people thought it was a firecracker. Others thought it was a motorcycle backfiring. But Michael knew, not because of the sound itself, but because of the president's movement. Kennedy raised his hands to his throat. "He's been hit," Thomas whispered. In the recording of the session, according to Dr. Evelyn, the chair can be heard creaking as the boy curls inward. He brought his hand to his own throat and began to cry without opening his eyes. "I saw it. I saw his hand go up. I knew it was too late." Governor Connolly was also hit. Jacqueline turned toward her husband. The agents began to react. The car was still moving. The crowd, which seconds earlier had been shouting with joy, became a mass of panic. Then came the shot that changed history. Thomas did not describe it graphically. He only said, after the second one, "The world ended." He repeated it 3 times. "The world ended." In Michael's memory, there was no organized sound anymore. Only screams, engine noise, tires, voices on the radio, someone saying to go to the hospital, someone running, someone climbing onto the car, Jacqueline trying to reach something that the mind of a person in shock should never have to reach. Thomas cried heavily during this part. She didn't want to leave him. She knew, but she didn't want to know. The limousine sped toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. The drive took only a few minutes, but in Michael's memory it felt like an entire lifetime. He said he was consumed by a physical guilt, like a blade lodged between his ribs. You train for that moment. You repeat it. You imagine it. You say you'll jump, that you'll cover him, that you'll see it first, but when it happens too fast. The entire history fit into 6 seconds. At the hospital, everything became white corridors, urgent voices, and closing doors. Kennedy was taken into the trauma room. Doctors moved around him. Agents stood outside, not knowing where to put their hands, not knowing who to look at, not knowing how to keep breathing. At 1 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was declared dead. When Thomas said it, he did not sound like a child repeating a date from a book. He sounded like someone reliving a sentence. Dr. Evelyn asked what Michael felt in that moment. The boy answered, "Shame, not fear, not sadness, shame. I had one job." Then came silence. He said the following days were unreal. The president's body was taken back to Washington. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One. Jacqueline was still wearing the same stained suit, refusing to change immediately, as if she wanted everyone to see what had been done. Michael, according to Thomas, remained in service, but something inside him had broken. He attended meetings, answered questions, reviewed maps, schedules, positions, angles. He replayed every second in his mind. Where he looked, where he did not look, how long it took him to react, how many steps separated him from the car, which window he should have watched longer. The question never left him. What if? What if the route had been different? What if the bubble top had been on? What if he had shouted sooner? What if he had seen the rifle? What if he had moved 1 second faster? That is the cruelest part of guilt. It does not need to prove that you could have stopped something. It only needs to convince you that maybe you could have. Thomas said Michael kept working for some time, but he was never the same again. He started drinking. He slept little. He avoided televisions. He could not bear to see images of Dallas. Whenever someone mentioned Kennedy in a room, he found an excuse to leave. In one especially strong memory, he said he was sitting alone in a small kitchen years later, with a bottle on the table and an old folded newspaper beside it. On the front page was a photograph of the president smiling in the limousine, the last image of a man who did not yet know he was living his final minutes. The motorcade left the airport shortly after noon. In the presidential car were Kennedy, Jacqueline, Texas Governor John Connally, Nellie Connally, and driver William Greer. The limousine was open. Behind it came the agents. Around it were motorcycles. Ahead, the city seemed to be celebrating. Thomas began narrating the scene as if he were there. There are people everywhere. Some climb onto poles. Others are in the windows. Children wave. Women scream his name. He smiles. He always smiles when he should lower his head. Dr. Evelyn asked where Michael was. Thomas narrowed his eyes. At the back. Close enough to see his hand go up. Too far away to stop it. He said the route seemed normal, but there was a discomfort growing in his chest. It was not clear information. It was not a specific warning. It was instinct. The kind of feeling an agent learns to respect, but cannot always justify. When the limousine entered Dealey Plaza, the boy began breathing faster. There's the brick building. There are windows. Too many windows. I look up, but there are too many people. Too much movement. Too much sun. The route passed in front of the Texas School Book Depository. The limousine slowed down to make the turn onto Elm Street. It was at that moment, according to Thomas's account, that everything in the world seemed to become strange. Dr. Evelyn asked what his name was. The boy hesitated. Michael. Michael what? He frowned, as if searching for something inside an old drawer. Michael Rourke. His mother, sitting in the corner of the room, covered her mouth with her hand. Thomas continued. I work for him. I stay close, but not too close. You learn that. You have to be close enough to die for him, but far enough away to see where the danger is coming from. Evelyn asked who he was. Thomas answered without hesitation. The president. The room went still. President Kennedy. From that moment on, the boy began describing an entire life that, according to him, did not belong to the small body sitting in that armchair. He said Michael Rourke had been born in 1924 in Boston, the son of an Irish police officer and a strict Catholic mother. He grew up hearing that discipline was a form of love. He served in the army at the end of World War II, came home with few stories and many silences, and joined the Secret Service in the early 1950s. According to Thomas, Michael was not an important man. He was not the boss. He was not the face that appeared in the photographs. He was one of those men who existed at the edges of historical images, always in a dark suit, always alert, always looking in the opposite direction from everyone else. When everyone looks at the president, you look at the windows, the boy said during the session. When everyone applauds, you look for the hand that isn't applauding. He said he had met Kennedy before the presidency, when Kennedy was still a senator. People called him Jack, but not everyone had permission to use that name. Michael called him Sir, always. Even when Kennedy smiled and said it made him sound older than he really was. Thomas described Kennedy as a man with quick charm, tired eyes, and a kind of sadness hidden behind his smile. He said Kennedy walked with more pain than he showed. Sometimes, after long events, when the cameras were gone and the doors were closed, Kennedy would discreetly place a hand on his lower back, take a deep breath, and stand without speaking for a few seconds. He suffered more than he let the country see, Thomas said. According to that memory, Michael saw Kennedy in moments the public would never see. He saw the president playing with Caroline in a White House hallway. He saw John Jr. running among important adults without understanding that his father was one of the most watched men in the world. He saw Jacqueline Kennedy adjust her husband's tie before a reception, with a gesture so intimate and normal that for 1 second they seemed like just a family and not a living showcase for America. Thomas said Kennedy treated the agents with politeness, but also with a certain distance. Not out of arrogance, out of protection, as if he knew that any affection could turn into weakness. Still, there were moments, small conversations inside cars, comments about baseball, questions about children. Once, according to Michael, Kennedy asked him if he believed in destiny. Michael answered that he believed in training. Kennedy laughed. Men like you are the reason men like me can believe in destiny. Thomas said that sentence during the regression, and then remained silent for almost a minute. Dr. Evelyn asked what he was seeing. Texas, he answered. It was November 1963. The trip to Texas had been planned as an attempt to bring Kennedy closer to important political groups before the next election. There was tension, there was criticism, there were people who loved the president and people who hated him with an intensity that was difficult to measure. According to Thomas, Michael felt it in the air even before they boarded. Some places feel wrong before something happens, he said. Dallas felt wrong. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy woke up in Fort Worth. It rained early, but later the sky cleared. That mattered more than it seemed. If the rain had continued, perhaps the limousine's transparent bubble top would have been used. But the sun came out. The crowd wanted to see the president. The president wanted to be seen. Thomas described Love Field Airport as noisy, warm, full of flowers, cameras, and people pressing against barriers. Jacqueline Kennedy was beside her husband, wearing the pink suit that would later be burned forever into the country's memory. The boy described the fabric, the hat, the greetings, her smile, but when he spoke about Kennedy, his voice changed. He was happy, he said, lighter than in the days before, as if for a few minutes he had forgotten the weight on top of him.